sports. Watching live sports is incredible.
They're going to mute us in a minute.
Welcome to the June 8th meeting of the Rotary Club of West Jacksonville. Zoom attendees, please mute yourself and submit any questions via the chat function. Our invocation and pledge will be given today by Palmer Bell.
Yes, Ed was going to do the pledge today and has an appointment he couldn't get out of. So he asked if I would do the pledge as well. So remain standing after our prayer. Gracious God, as we gather again for our Rotary lunch, we put aside all the ways we're different and celebrate our common interests. We're thankful for our food and the people that have prepared it, and ask that you nourish us too for our friendships and our conversation and even the busyness of our lives. Use our service and interests to temper the anger, division, and distrust that's so much a part of the lives we see every day. Model in us and through us a way that there is a way that is better. Amen.
Amen.
Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Palmer. Thank you, Carl Dawson, for greeting today with Rahul at the door. Announcements. I want to recognize Phil Voss is back with us today. Give Phil a hand. I'd like to ask Will Tesh to come up and do a pop-up. And while he's coming up, I'll do another important announcement. There are 4 beds open in the Big Red Bus right now. So you have an opportunity to save a life and impact your community. 4 beds available. Don't need an appointment. You're excused to go out when you want to.
I wanted to thank and tell everybody I appreciate their participation in the St. Johns River cleanup from this past Saturday. We did a cleanup for about 2 hours Saturday morning. Got a ton of trash, probably just the tip of an iceberg out there, really, but something we need to do a little bit more often, whether it's our highways, the river, the banks. But had about 20 people out there, friends and family. So thank you, guys.
Well done, Will. Thank you for coordinating that. Thank you for everybody who participated. Make sure you sign up for the President's Party. The President's Party is June 29th, 6 p.m. here at Timuquana. We need to get a really accurate head count for that. I encourage everybody to attend, bring your spouses, bring your Rotary partners. It's a real special night for incoming President Sean and her board. So please come support that. Also, really important announcement. Dave Collier will be 90 years old this Friday. So I'd like to, let's sing happy birthday to Dave. To you. Dave, congratulations on the milestone. The cupcake is lovely. Your singing, not so good. Not so good. Okay. Really exciting day today for us. We have a lot of guests in the audience. We do every year, West Jax Rotary does a charity grant project, and Jeff Rayner leads that committee. Jeff and that committee worked very hard, and we have some checks to distribute today. I'd like to call up Dr. Jeff Idling from the Jacksonville Zoo. Congratulations, Jeff. Crystal Banks from Diaper Bank. And Beth Mixon from Family Promise. I'd like to ask you guys to just stick around after the meeting. We'll get some photographs. And your members, our members will be asking a lot of questions about what you do. So we're very excited to support you and support the wonderful work you do in our community. Family of Rotary, Kathy Cole.
All right, birthdays today. We already heard, birthdays this week. We already heard about Dave Collier, who is June 10th. We have President-elect Sean Asmuth had her birthday on June 6th, and Mark Eldred had his birthday on June 7th. Mark and Donna Halsey, who may be joining us on Zoom, they're out of town. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary yesterday on June 7th. And speaking of marriage, I heard my husband and son talking last night, and my son was saying to my husband that he couldn't believe that there are still places in the world where men don't even know their wives before they get married. And my husband said, son, that happens everywhere.
Thank you, Kathy. Would like to turn it over to Rahul Sharma for our Sergeant of Arms report. And Rahul will introduce Dr. Wallace, or Judge Wallace, who will introduce the program.
Thank you very much, President Sherlock. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our Rotary Game Day crew for getting us set up today. What's going to be a great meeting. We're off to a great start. Special thanks to Stu Irwin, Patty Chapman, and Joe Springer. Let's give it up for those three. West Jax Rotary believes in community, family, and friends. I'd like to take this time to also welcome our visiting Rotarians that are joining our club today for a very special occasion. How about the Ettlingers from the Oceanside Rotary? Please stand. Glad to have you all as part of our program today. Welcome. Carolyn and Elliot, welcome. John Fanning is here as well. John, glad to have you. Stand up, John, from Orange Park. Welcome back, John. You know, we actually talked about Dave Collier earlier today. Yes, there's room for improvement for our birthday song for you, Dave, but I'll tell you this. We're really also glad to have Miss Glenda Collier here sitting next to you, your beautiful bride. Glenda, please stand. Welcome. Welcome to West Jax Rotary. Welcome. Allison Loiza, you came and joined us a couple of weeks back. Please stand, Allison. Ken Baker, a guest of Ken Baker, Allison Loiza. Welcome back. Krista Canlish, you've heard that name before. Krista, please stand. I think this is going to be a regular pretty soon. Krista Canlish going to be part of West Jax Rotary. And how about Vincent Coyle? This guy brings energy every time he enters the club, and he'd like to introduce a guest today. Vincent.
Yeah, it's a privilege of mine. One of my mentors is here, as well as my older brother, Pat Coyle.
Welcome, Pat. Welcome. I'm going to, before I ask the club to join me in welcoming Judge Wallace to the podium for a very special introduction of our guest speaker today, I wanted to share with you guys a couple of ageless quotes that serve as inspiration, but are very applicable to Rotary and our Rotary family here at West Jax. Personally, I've learned that every day we should all reach out to one another, touch someone. People love that human touch. Holding hands, a warm hug, or just a friendly pat on the back, that makes a big difference. And it certainly does no matter what kind of day we're having. And so that's something that I wanted to share with our club today. It's just a friendly reminder that fundamental behavior. I've also learned that if you pursue happiness, it will elude you. What do I mean by that? If you pursue happiness, it will elude you. But if you focus on family, your friends, the needs of others, your work, meeting new people, and doing the very best you can, happiness will find you. I wanted to share that with the group today, with my brothers and sisters here that are part of West Jax Rotary. Earlier, we thanked Carl Dawson for welcoming members today. How about Stephen Rowland, also first-year Rotarian, helping greet members today? Stephen, thank you so much for your efforts, man, making an immediate impact. Okay. Brothers and sisters, friends and family, please join me in providing a warm welcome to Judge Del Wallace, who will introduce our speaker today. Judge, come on up. Thanks, Judge. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it is a special occasion here for me to have my family, my sister and brother-in-law, and my nephew, Scott, here. And the occasion is to introduce him as our speaker for a very important purpose. I feel badly because a couple other family members can't be here today. Tom Schneider, our new member, Tom had set this up and had the idea and coordinated that with me and then with Scott. And he was coming back from Indiana and has COVID of all things. So we miss Tom and his wife. My sister Nancy was going to be here, but they can't be here today. They're here in spirit. My sister Carolyn's a Lehigh person. Some of you may have been in that class back, was it 69? Or maybe I shouldn't have said that. And then Tom is married to Chip and Phyllis Towsey's daughter. Anyway, some of you may know Chip. He grew up on this side of town as well and was a Lee High School person. But we'll get on to Scott, who is our speaker today. He's a native, of course. He grew up here, went to Bowles and graduated from Mandarin High School. Then he went to Guilford College in North Carolina. And from there, he went to a great institution, the University of Virginia, where he studied there for quite some time and got a PhD in American history. Studied under Julian Bond, who was Scott's mentor and close teacher there. But he graduated there, did a dissertation, which turned into a book published by University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Press. And the book was Capturing the South, Imagining America's Most Documented Region. And I guarantee you, he spent years really traveling around the South, going to churches and small communities and indexing and researching the not video, but the pictorial and literary and music history of the South. And fascinating study. And you can pick up his book and read that. But after he left the University of Virginia, he taught for a while at Hollins. It used to be a Hollins College when I was up there at Hollins University. And then after that, he went to Georgia State in Atlanta and taught there for a while. And then I think the family prevailed upon him. He came back to Jacksonville, where they've got the Towseys and the Etlingers. They're very interested in having the granddaughter back home. Anyway, Scott has been teaching at Florida State College at Jacksonville in history and has been doing that for several years now. And then he came up with the idea of doing something about Jacksonville's history. And that idea took form. I think you may have heard about that. We talked with the president of the university a little bit about that. But Scott is starting a class which is open to members of the public about the history of Jacksonville. And he's here to speak to us today about what that class is about and the importance of teaching and getting to know the history of Jacksonville. So with that said, I want to introduce to you Dr. Scott Matthews, Professor of History at Florida State College, Jacksonville. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Del, and thank you all for being here. This is quite an honor. And I've got a lot to talk about today, and I know my time is short. So let me just go ahead and dive right in. As Del was saying, this fall semester at FSCJ, we'll be offering, for the first time, as far as I know, a comprehensive course on the history of Jacksonville. I've heard from different people that growing up here in Jacksonville and Duval County Public Schools, they had classes that incorporated Jacksonville history. But as far as we know, to this date, no school has offered a formal comprehensive class. And so what we're offering this fall is unique. Beginning in the fall, this class will be only available to degree-seeking students. However, we are hoping by the spring 2023 semester, so by early January, this will be a class that will be available fully online and to those who want to take it on an audit basis or a continuing education basis. As I will discuss, this is a class that we want to emphasize has importance that goes beyond just the classroom at FSCJ. We are envisioning this class as generating community-wide discussions about our history that will go a long way to kind of healing the, and binding together the fractures that exist in our social fabric here in Jacksonville, in increasing a deeper sense of appreciation for where we live, which we hope will increase civic engagement as well. So part of my talk today, though, is about briefly, I'm going to do three things today. I'm going to talk about the origins of the class, and that will be quite brief. Then I'm going to talk about what I hope students in the community will benefit, how the community and my students will benefit from this class. So I'm going to talk about 5 key features. And then I'm going to close today by talking about some of the topics we're going to cover. This, unfortunately, is not a talk about the history of Jacksonville. However, I will be weaving in local history to make my broader points about what we're hoping to accomplish with this course. And I should also point out very briefly before I begin, we all know that we are celebrating this month in particular, the bicentennial of Jacksonville. This course was not designed to coincide with the bicentennial. We were just fortunate to have good timing. And yet it provides an opportunity, the bicentennial that is, to force us to reflect on our community's history. And I think what the important thing this course is going to do is going to create a sustained platform for discussing and learning about Jacksonville history, something that goes beyond just a one-year celebration. So is it possible to bring up an image real quick, the first PowerPoint slide for everyone to see? This photograph here is one that y'all might be familiar with. This is a kind of encapsulation in many ways of some of the dominant themes in our course. Just so you know, I always show this image to begin my discussion. This is a photograph from January of 1912, and it is taken where today would be the foot of Hogan Street and Water Street. On the left side would be the Times Union Center. On the right side, at least my left and right, would have been what is now no longer the Jacksonville Landing, but that gives you a sense of the location here. And I always emphasize to my students when looking at this photograph, of course, this is 11 years after the fire. You can already see Jacksonville having rebuilt itself. You see that one of the hallmark features of that, what was contributing to Jacksonville's growth, and that is we, of course, were a river port city by the sea. You see men on their lunch break working alongside the wharves. Jacksonville, particularly during the first 2 decades after the fire, was a city that grew at an extraordinarily rapid rate. Massive in-migration, particularly from the Deep South, but also from states up north and overseas. We had a growing immigrant population here. And then beyond the men here at the dock, you can see the building where the Florida Times Union was. Beyond that, in the distance, you can see the Seminole Hotel. Jacksonville, not so much after the fire as it was before the fire, but remained a tourist city. We were the first city that kind of gave birth to modern Florida as a tourist destination, and you can see vestiges of that in this image. All right. So the origins of this course began when I had my job interview here at FSCJ. As my uncle Del said, I moved from Atlanta to Jacksonville in 2015. When I interviewed at FSCJ, I was given a topic. Part of my interview involved me giving a talk, and the topic was to discuss the history of Reconstruction and its relevance. Now, for those of y'all who remember your American history, Reconstruction is a massive topic. It's oftentimes very misunderstood, but in short, it was the question of how was the United States going to come back together after the tragedy and the devastation of the Civil War? How are we going to reconstruct a republic and our democracy after the end of this brutal war and after the abolition of slavery? A whole host of questions that went with that process of Reconstruction. So I began to think about, well, how am I going to make this interesting and relevant? How am I going to say something new about Reconstruction? And I decided to ask myself, well, what could I say about Jacksonville's experience during Reconstruction? And then further, when I gave my job talk downtown, how can I make it even more immediate to FSCJ in Jacksonville? And I began to look at the downtown landscape and thought, well, to the north of FSCJ's campus is Bethel Baptist Church. To its south is First Baptist Church. Why are they separated? Because both congregations have a common history. To understand that separation, you have to understand the history of Reconstruction. And so what I began to tell the committee during my job talk was that beginning in 1838, Bethel Baptist was the first Baptist church established in Jacksonville. It was established by men. I don't know if you can see him, but on my right side, Reverend Ryan Fryer of South Georgia, who came to Jacksonville. Other white members of the Baptist Church established Bethel Baptist in 1838, but from the very beginning, Bethel had a Black majority congregation. Enslaved men and women and children could become members of Bethel Baptist Church, like other Baptist church throughout the nation. And throughout Bethel's long history, even though the governance was controlled by white members, it had a Black majority population. So what does that mean for Reconstruction? Well, in the aftermath of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the question begins to arise in Bethel and so many other churches throughout the country that had once mixed race congregations. Who gets to decide church affairs? For enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, now free, many of them, having attended churches where they had no voice, wanted to control their own congregations. They wanted to establish their own independent churches. And the members of Bethel said, we're in the majority. It's our tithing money that goes to supporting this church. We should be able to dictate what we do and who we choose as our pastor at Bethel Baptist. The white members said, we were the ones who founded this church. This is our church from the beginning. Well, in short, this goes to court. And in Duval County in 1868, a Duval County judge sided with the Black members who got to retain the name of Bethel Baptist Church. And then the white members sold them the church structure itself. Black members went on to build their own structure. And then the white members were forced to establish a whole separate church, which they first named Tabernacle Baptist and then became First Baptist. So if you look at a map, and I hope you can see it, of downtown Jacksonville, FSCJ is in the tan shaded area there. You can see Union Street and Laura Street. Just to the north, of course, is Bethel Baptist. And then in the southeast corner of that map is First Baptist. So I said, here at the downtown campus, students can walk outside and see the legacy of Reconstruction to their north and to their south. That physical separation is a reflection of that history. And so, I don't know if it was that specific talk that got me the job, but I was fortunate enough to get the job at FSCJ. And I said, even in my interview, this is exactly kind of what I want to do. Students have become so familiar, some students, with the narrative of American history that it's become almost like an abstraction. American history has become a mythology. The names, the places, the events, even the dates seem like something that are just out of a movie almost. It doesn't seem real to students. So how do I make history seem alive and immediate? And that's what led me to think about incorporating Jacksonville history into my courses and then developing an idea for a formal course, a comprehensive course on Jacksonville history. So here then are what I hope students will take from this course and by extension, the Jacksonville community. If you wouldn't mind going to this course. So my first goal, and what I hope students take from this course, is that this will make history relevant and intellectually and creatively inspiring. That is a struggle professors face in any course, but particularly in history. Studies have shown, believe it or not, going back 20 years now, graduating high school seniors oftentimes rank history at the very bottom of their favorite classes. And that's in part a product of how history has been taught. It's been taught about memorize these series of names, dates, and facts, and then spit them back to us on a multiple choice exam. I think in this first goal of making history relevant and intellectually and creatively inspiring, this is not so much about Jacksonville history, but it's about using local Jacksonville history to deepen an appreciation for the importance of history and the craft of history. History is not about memorizing facts or spitting back facts. It's about interpreting evidence, creating ideas, and creating meaning, how people created meaning, why people made the decisions that they made in the past, and getting students to use Jacksonville as a kind of laboratory or a field site for doing their own research in primary sources and writing their own original work. And I take as my inspiration here a quote from one of American history's premier historians and thinkers about the importance of local history, Lewis Mumford, who's a great urban historian. And this is what Lewis Mumford said. If you can't read that quote, I will read it now. Because local history is relatively accessible and immediate, because it deals with the concrete and commonplace, it is what is necessary to vitalize the teaching of general history to the child at school, to say nothing of more mature students. In this Jacksonville history course, my students will be doing research in local archives. We are just down the street at the downtown campus from the Jacksonville Public Library. We're close to the Jacksonville Historical Society. I'll be encouraging students to go down the street to the Ritz Museum. The Clara White Mission has a fantastic archive of the work of humanitarians Eartha White and her mother, Clara White. Universities, including UNF, JU, and FSCJ also have extraordinary archives of local materials. And so getting students introduced to the craft of history, what historians actually do, is an important goal. And one of the other things students will be doing is writing original scholarship. And this will be something that I'm going to be steering them towards topics that have not been written on. So for instance, students will not be writing a history of consolidation using the well-known books by Jim Crooks and Richard Martin. I want to push them towards new ideas, new topics that have not been explored. And in that way, this is going to become a course where student work, student research will help create a new narrative of Jacksonville history. When students' papers, oftentimes at the end of the semester, are graded, traditionally they just are forgotten about. Professors file them away or throw them away. Students forget about them. But in this course, I'm going to do my best to incorporate the findings of students and have their histories of Jacksonville become part of the course content. I will even assign student essays in future classes so that students get a sense of the importance of the work that they're doing. All right, next slide. The other thing I want to do is to emphasize how local history relates to both regional, national, and even global history. To see Jacksonville embedded in a much broader field of history than just local concerns. And I'm going to do this in a number of different ways. And I'm just going to show you one example here today. But that idea of connecting the local with the global can perhaps best be seen in an example from 1565. Now, most of you are perhaps familiar with the history of Fort Caroline. You know that Fort Caroline was established really beginning in 1564 by a group of French colonists, Huguenots, that is French Protestants, and that from the view of their rival Spain, they were interlopers, they were invaders. They were not just national rivals, but they were also religious rivals. And so what I oftentimes tell my students is that 1 year later, in September 1565, a massacre happens along the banks of the St. Johns River near what is today St. John's Bluff that actually has direct implications and direct connections going back to the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther. So what happens on the banks of the St. Johns River, and why does this relate to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation? Well, in September of 1565, Pedro Menendez, who had just founded St. Augustine, and a group of Spaniards and Timucua Indians march up from St. John's into Duval County. They march through the rain over 2 days. They come to St. John's Bluff to Fort Caroline. And once the sun came up on one morning in September 1565, they attacked the French and they slaughter the vast majority of the French people there. Some, it is said, Menendez and his men hanged from trees and draped placards or signs around their necks. And those signs said, "We do not do this to Frenchmen, we do this to Lutherans," i.e. Spaniards, Protestants, So in a sense, what Menendez and the Spanish are doing here, what this massacre reveals, is that Northeast Florida, Fort Caroline, became a kind of microcosm of the broader history of national European rivalries and the fracturing of Western Christendom. The rivalries that took place in the New World, right here in Northeast Florida, would not have been possible without the breakup of Christendom with the Protestant Reformation. As one historian has said, the distance is not so far from the ink spilled by Martin Luther in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517 to the French Protestant blood spilled at Fort Caroline. And so there'll be other examples, and really you can go throughout Jacksonville history and see how the local connects, not just to the regional, to the broader history of the South, and not just to the broader history of America, but to global history. Emphasizing those interconnections will be important. The next goal in this class, and I will just briefly highlight this image. I wanted to give another example of the local and the global, but I just don't have time. This is the history of Zephaniah Kingsley and Anna Kingsley. This is a history that will shed light on the global dimensions of the history of slavery. The St. John's River and the plantations from the mouth of the St. John's River down through Clay and even into Putnam counties is related to the broader history of slavery that stretches throughout the Atlantic world, throughout the Caribbean to West Africa. And the lives of Zephaniah Kingsley, a plantation owner and slave trader, and his quote unquote wife, an enslaved woman named Anna Kingsley, who he later freed and bore children with, they too provide a local dimension of a broader global history. The third thing I want to do in this class, and what I hope it does, is that it nurtures a deeper sense of connection between citizens and residents of Jacksonville. Jacksonville, like anywhere else, is not simply a place. A place is a set of relationships, a web of relationships and connections. We are not just citizens, we are neighbors, we're coworkers, we're members of service clubs, we're members of religious congregations and civic groups. And what I hope this class does is emphasize not our isolation in our place across social and cultural boundaries, but our deep interconnection. To that end, students will be writing personal histories, personal biographies about why they are in Jacksonville. In those personal histories, we're going to collectively kind of piece together to create a class history of Jacksonville to emphasize those interconnections. And we'll be doing that repeatedly throughout the semester, and something I hope we extend into the community as well. You can move to the next one. All right. Fourth and almost final thing I hope to accomplish in this class, any local history class should nurture a sense of place, a sense of what makes a community unique. And one of the driving questions of this class is going to be, well, what makes Jacksonville unique? Now, we could all sit here and spend the rest of the afternoon listing all the idiosyncratic things about Jacksonville, the river most obviously, and that's important, but that's not what I'm getting at in this course. What I'm emphasizing here is something that makes Jacksonville unique that can go across centuries, common themes and ideas that are persistent, even though they change over time. This is always a question for me growing up here in Jacksonville. Though I was a third generation Jacksonville native, sometimes I wondered, well, what makes Jacksonville Jacksonville? It's at once in Florida, but it's not necessarily of Florida and our stereotypical image of Florida. It's in the South and in the deep South more specifically, although Jacksonville's history doesn't quite align with other deep South areas and cities. So what makes Jacksonville unique? And I came to this belief through my study is that Jacksonville has historically been a border region, a transition zone between cultures and empires. We are a place going back even to the 11th century. And this map, if you can see it, is a map of the Mississippian Indian world. The Mississippians were mound builders, were city builders, whose civilizations sprang up along the Mississippi River and then spread throughout what is today the Midwest and the Southeast. But the Mississippian Indian world ended just northwest of Jacksonville, where it transitioned into the St. John's culture and then eventually the Timucua people. So that theme of a borderland we can see in the 11th century, if you'll move to the next slide, but it continues all the way into the 20th and the 21st century. In my class, I'm going to be talking a lot about cultural geography, about the cultural history of Jacksonville. In part, why it's sometimes difficult to define what makes Jacksonville, Jacksonville, and to establish a clear identity for the city is A, we have not done a good job of telling our cultural history, not our political or military or institutional history. We have fantastic books on all of those topics. But in terms of culture, our language, our foodways, our traditions and customs, those forms of culture have not been well understood. And it's also in part because, as you can see here, we're a border region. Now, this might look a little messy, but these are all boundary markers created by geographers. And they are referring to where major cultural regions begin and end, or where major religious regions. So in short, these lines are showing where cultural geographers have said, this is where the South, the southern extent of the cultural South, or the southern extent of the quote unquote Bible Belt, which basically means Protestant majority region, where church attendance is above the national average. Well, what do we see? We see that Northeast Florida, once again, most often right at the Duval County, St. Johns County border, is the southern extent of the quote unquote cultural South. Others draw the line further south into the peninsula of Florida. But you can see here that theme going from the 11th century up to the 21st, that we are a kind of transition zone, moving from the deep South into Florida. That sometimes is very hard to define what makes Florida, Florida. And Jacksonville is kind of that transition. If you wouldn't mind switching to the next slide. We won't have time for that, I'm sorry. Here is a map of Gullah Geechee historical corridor. And I know you might not be able to see it there with that bar, but the Gullah Geechee, which is a unique subset of an African-American culture that grew up particularly along the Sea Islands of Southeast of America. The Gullah Geechee retained a lot of West African forms of spirit worship, of language, of foodways. The Gullah Geechee were most prominent again in the Southeast, where enslaved people were in the vast majority, had less influence from Europeans and European Americans, and could retain vestiges of a West African cultural heritage. Well, that Gullah Geechee cultural region, the southern extent of it ends right at the Duval County, St. Johns County line. We again are a transition zone, the southern border of a cultural region. If you wouldn't mind the next slide. This is another interesting map. This is a map, believe it or not, people are paid to do this, of a sociologist who went through phone books in the 1970s and 1980s and looked at areas where Southern was used more often than American in its business name. So Southern Heating and Air, Southern Landscaping. And he found that this was the area where most people use the word Southern more often than American in the phone books, in their advertising their businesses. Once again, that boundary line is just south of Jacksonville, if you wouldn't mind. We also see Jacksonville as a border or transition region in terms of accent and dialect. Here's a map that is showing a very general picture of where is the Southern accent. Now, there are subsets of the Southern accent. You can tell where, at least I like to think I can, when I hear someone speak, I can usually tell if they're from Virginia, Eastern North Carolina, the Mississippi Delta, South Georgia. So there are many different Southern accents, but this is a general map showing where one geographer has drawn where the native Southern accent still existed in the late 20th century. Not imported accents, but accents that were born in a particular place. According to this map, it basically ends in St. Johns County, although you could argue that's no longer the case. It's moved out. One more map, please. Now, this is a map that's going to be much harder to look at, but I'll briefly talk about it. This is a more updated map showing the diversity of Southern accents. And in this map, the St. Johns River is the barrier between native Southern accents, whereas east of the St. Johns River, according to this map, the native-born Southern accent has eventually died out. The areas in deep red is the deep South accent that basically comes into far northeast Florida to Baker County. You go a little bit to the east, you're in a green shaded area where the older generation who are born in the area still has a Southern accent. The younger generation, which would be me, has a very faint one. I don't know if that would be accurate. And then the people who are not native have no accent whatsoever. And so that green shaded area is an area where the Southern accent, in short, is dying out. And it reminds me of my family dinners going back from my childhood. Some of y'all might have known Colonel Bill Tomlinson. He was Uncle Dell's father-in-law who recently passed away. But at the end of every dinner, we lived over in Mandarin at the time, Bill Tomlinson would say, all right, family, we need to go back over to the redneck side of the river, meaning we need to go back to the west side. And in some sense, this map shows the river as a kind of cultural division between east side of Jacksonville and the west side. Once again, Jacksonville is a kind of transition zone. All right, I think I have one more image. And I should point out here, this idea of Jacksonville as a transition zone, we can even see it in how people have defined the area. Basically from about 1920 up to, I would say, about 1995, given the demographics of the city, that Jacksonville, beginning in the 19-teens into the 1920s, increasingly became known as South Georgia. Or it became known, and this is going to be somewhat derogatory, as a cracker town. What does that mean? It means that the city's cultural composition was completely remade by massive in-migration, Black and white, from rural Florida and rural Georgia and portions of South Carolina. And that new influx of people shifted Jacksonville's demographics and cultural makeup from a city that before the Civil War in 1860, 44% of white heads of households in Jacksonville were born in the North. Has tremendous implications for the history of Civil War in Jacksonville. Well, that sort of regional diversity begins to change rapidly in the 20th century. So by later in the 20th century, Jacksonville, according to, this is a survey done, how do people identify certain areas of Florida? Jacksonville became known as South Georgia. That deep South identity was created here, but if you go one more slide, please. By the end of the 21st century, Jacksonville was no longer South Georgia. It was very much trying to brand itself as Florida's first coast. More recently, the chamber, I believe, has tried to talk about Jacksonville as, what I think the slogan is, it's easier here. We've tried to kind of shift our identity a little bit while retaining something that makes us unique. And you can see that Jacksonville is no longer South Georgia in cultural perceptions because we are a city that is increasingly cosmopolitan, immigration from not only other places across the United States, but across the globe. So emphasizing that uniqueness, what makes Jacksonville, Jacksonville is something that we will follow throughout the course, and one from the very origins of human settlement here all the way up to the present. And the last thing I want to say is that I also hope this class will inspire greater civic engagement. I'm going to read you one quote that could apply to American history as much as it could apply to Jacksonville history. And this is from a local historian named John Archibald, who did a lot of important work in St. Louis. And John Archibald said this about historical knowledge and civic engagement. I speculate that if I could find the formula, I could equate the loss of historical awareness with a decline in civic engagement, that sense of common purpose that compels us to consider the common welfare. The study of history has become, like just about everything under the sun, a form of cultural warfare today. It's become something that has divided people, that has reinforced the ugly divisions in our world. And I hope this course will present history in a way that sees it as something that inspires us to build bridges, that inspires us to actively engage for the betterment of our communities and not create silly, senseless divisions. I cannot emphasize that enough. And lastly, I will just point out here, this is a course, as I said, that is going to be comprehensive in its scope. I'll be happy to talk to you more about some of the specific topics, but this is just a list of the major modules that will be covered. These modules are major topics, and students will have access to unique readings, both primary sources, original documents created at the time an event or an era was occurring, and the best scholarship on those topics. And so, as I've been telling students, when you take this course, you're getting materials you cannot get anywhere else. And I hope students will develop a lifelong appreciation, not just of Jacksonville history, but the craft and the importance of history going forward. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
A unique reflection of community history provided today in a wonderful presentation from Dr. Scott Matthews. Let's give him a round of applause. Dr. Matthews, the producer in my ears, tell me I have time for one quick question,
Okay.
and I'm going to send it back to President Sherlock at the podium. Glenda, I saw was kind of motioning me. Did you have a question, dear? You did not have a question. Are there any questions from the audience? If you have a hand that goes up, Carl Dawson's got a question. I'm going to make my way around the room so everyone can hear CD. He's already loud as it is, but let's give him the microphone here. CD.
Scott, what would you do with the Confederate statues out there right now?
Wow, you're really putting me on the spot. All right, so I have two answers to that. I have the historical answer, and that is any decision about any monument has to be understood in terms of the actual history that informed the creation of a monument, and that helps us understand what does it offer us today. Now, in Jacksonville, as I said, the history of the Civil War in Jacksonville is fascinating. We were a city that was divided against itself. We were a city where the Mason-Dixon line was not something that separated Maryland and Pennsylvania. It was something that was coursing through Jacksonville. We were a city that had a significant northern-born white population that went on, and some who went and fought for the Union, and then came back to Jacksonville afterwards. We also had Northerners who moved from Vermont and Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts down to Jacksonville, who became dyed-in-the-wool Confederates who owned slaves and voted for secession. Then we had Florida, Jacksonville, Georgia, South Carolina-born Southerners who were loyal to the Union, and then others who were silent, who simply went with the winds of the war. And it's no surprise, though, that President Lincoln and his cabinet believed that Northeast Florida was ripe for readmission into the Union because they even knew amongst its white population there was significant Union support. Well, why was that? It's partly because of Northeast Florida's history. Florida was 15 years old when the Civil War broke out. There was not a deep allegiance to any one side per se. Now, it's important to recognize Jacksonville was a majority Confederate supporting city. That's undeniable. But what does that history show us? It shows us that Jacksonville was not a uniform Confederate-only city. Well, what does it mean then when you have, not in private land or in a museum, but on public ground, a monument only to the Confederacy? Well, we do have a Union monument here in Jacksonville, very unique again for a Deep South city. So that complex picture of Jacksonville's history needs to be understood. The second thing I will point out is that the most recent controversy, of course, is in Springfield Park, what was once known as Confederate Park. And before that, Dignan Park. But Dignan was a Catholic, and Catholic during the early 20th century were oftentimes persona non grata in the national political culture. And so it becomes known as Confederate Park in 1914. Well, the monument to the women of the Confederacy in Springfield Park, the irony of that history is that the daughters of the Confederacy, the primary engine, the movers and shakers that helped memorialize the Confederacy during the late 19th and early 20th century, the daughters of the Confederacy didn't want that monument there in the first place. They saw the depiction of Confederate women as demeaning, as passé, as old-fashioned. They said, rather than put up another monument, why don't you give us money so we can pay for the education of white girls from the South? Now, in addition to that fact, as an historian, and this is coming from me personally, I oftentimes wonder, on public land, what is it we're exactly memorializing with the Confederate monument? Do we think it tells history in the full complexity of actually what happened here? Who has been educated by that monument? Who looks at that monument and sees something that represents a rebellion against the United States of America? And despite what you may think, a Confederate government that had the full intention to maintain the existence of slavery during the late 19th century. That's the reality of it. We can debate about why Southerners seceded from the Union. We can debate about what individual soldiers believed they were fighting for in the war. All of my ancestors fought for the Confederacy. My great-great-grandfather fought at Gettysburg. He said he fought in the war because of my father's side of the family. The Yankees were invading North Carolina. He didn't own a single slave. My other side of my family were some of the largest slaveholders in Southeast Georgia. They were fighting to protect slavery. It's complex. But if we see it through others' eyes, those who were the descendants of the enslaved, then we have to think about what are we doing on common ground, on public land. Put that monument somewhere in private land. Learn about the Civil War. We need more public monuments that explain the full complexity of the Civil War and simply aren't sentimental monuments that mythologize history. We need a fuller, more complex portrait. It means more history, more public discussion. Taking away history or monument is not stripping history. It's presenting us with a new narrative and a new understanding. And at least in terms of public land, common land for all citizens, I personally do not see a place for a Confederate monument. And I say that as a descendant of Confederate soldiers and people who have lived in the South since the 17th century.
How about one more round of applause for Dr. Scott Matthews? President Sherlock, we'll send it back to you at the podium.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. Please join us next week here at Timuquana for lunch. Our speaker will be Sarah Boone from Theater Jacks. Please also sign up for the President's Party, June 29th, right here at Timuquana, 6 p.m. It's going to be a special night for the incoming president and the board. What a great day at West Rotary. Great speaker, and our guest, Jacksonville Zoo Family Promise Diaper Bank. It's really great for us to see where our dollars are going in the community. And we really appreciate the work you do in the community. You're the boots on the ground, you're the hands, and we really appreciate what you do. So thank you. Let's give them another hand. Past President Dan Dodd will lead us in our four-way test.
Fellow Rotarians, please join me in the four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. First, second, third, and fourth.
The quote of the week: love is not what makes the world go round. Love is what makes the ride worthwhile.